All right, let's kick off. So thank you everybody for joining us today and welcome to this month's Lunch and Learn seminar on understanding child sexual exploitation, policy and practice implications. Now, most of you won't know who I am. So my name is Matt Fusarelli. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Family Community Services Insights Analysis and Research. We're also known as FACSIAR, and we're part of the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. So I'd like to warmly welcome everybody today, our webinar participants, as well as our presenters. We've had over 1,250 people registered, which is great. And it shows the importance of this topic, not only to frontline staff, but also to the academic community, policymakers, our peak organisations, and staff from delivery agencies as well. So in today's FACSIAR webinar, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Sophie Hallett from Cardiff University. So Dr. Hallett's research has focused on caseworker perspectives on child sexual exploitation, and that was based on interviews with Australian caseworkers. Her study fills the gap in the Australian research landscape and helps improve understanding of child sexual exploitation. So following Dr. Hallett's presentation, we'll hear from a panel of experts at DCJ who will discuss the findings and the lessons and what that means for policy and practice. If you have any questions for the presenters or panel members, please put them in the chat during the webinar, and we'll come to those. At the end. I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware that we are going to be recording the session today, and the recording will be uploaded onto the FACSIAR webpage. And anybody who's registered for the webinar will receive the link to the recording. So just so people are aware. So at this stage, what I'd like to do is introduce our panel members for this afternoon. So first of all is Dr. Sophie Hallett. So Sophie is an associate professor in social policy at Cardiff University in Wales in the UK, and her expertise falls within the area of childhood, youth, social care, safeguarding and child protection. So her specialist field is in child sexual exploitation. Sophie has been engaged in co-developed research projects to enhance understanding of this abuse and how to best respond, involving young people and carers and multi-agency professionals who support them. We're also joined by Gregory Hall. So Gregory has a PhD and was the Deputy Director of the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse for England and Wales. And prior to that, was the Director of Safeguarding and Social Work with services with the British Overseas Territories, as well as in Queensland and New South Wales and Commonwealth Government here in Australia. He has extensive practice experience with marginalised young people and has led research exploring how to humanise public service systems. He is currently the Director of Community Services of the Mid-North Coast District for DCJ. We're also joined by Paul Bain. So Paul is a Manager of Client Services for the Metropolitan Intensive Support Services, or Metro ISS. He's a qualified social worker in England and has worked in statutory child protection, mainly in London inner boroughs, for 28 years before coming to live in Sydney and working in various roles in child protection and out-of-home care, either directly or in oversight roles. He leans on the learning and expertise gained in these areas into the management of teams and how they respond to sexually exploited children within the constraints of the service system and in the context of intensive support for children in out-of-home care. We've also got Dana Cooper, and Dana is a senior clinical psychologist working with the Links training and support team with DCJ Psychological and Specialist Services. Dana has extensive clinical experience within the public sector, working across the New South Wales Health Mental Health Services and Violence Prevention Services over 2 decades before joining DCJ Psychological Services in 2015. Dana holds specific interest in approaches that help better understand the trauma experiences of children and young people, specifically interventions which emphasise the attachment system as a foundation on which to base clinical intervention. What a great panel we've got here today with us. So that's enough from me. Thank you, and please go ahead, Sophie.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along today, particularly in the holidays as well. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking with you today, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. This Lunch and Learn today shares research undertaken in New South Wales on caseworkers' understandings of child sexual exploitation and challenges and opportunities for responding, giving particular consideration to responses to young people and children. I'll begin by giving some background to the research. I'll briefly share the aims, the research design, and who was involved, and then I'll share findings and discuss key messages and their potential implications. To give some context for those of you who may be unfamiliar with this issue, child sexual exploitation, or CSE, has no established definition in Australia, and neither is there a definition accepted globally. But generally, those that are used in Australia draw from those definitions which position the issue as a particular form of child sexual abuse, involving sexual activity with a child, including those up to the age of 18, in which a perpetrator may be gaining something and/or the child receives something that they may need or want. Given that I'm making sense of what this issue is, formed part of the research, this is something that I'm going to be returning to when sharing findings. In Australia, this received particular attention a few years ago as CSE abuses formed part of the findings from the Royal Commission in 2017. But it's acknowledged that there is still limited attention on this issue in terms of research and policy development and practice awareness. Where there has been research, this has generally been on interventions in out-of-home care residential care settings. And this attention has either looked at sexual abuse more broadly or harmful sexual behaviour and child sexual exploitation combined, with a focus on peers. In terms of definitional understandings used in research and in practice directions that were developed around the time of the Commission, these have drawn from particular early understandings of the issue in England and the UK, and these have emphasised the boyfriend model of this abuse, that this is about unknown perpetrators who groom a vulnerable child over a period of time in order to then sexually abuse and exploit them. Generally, responses have focused on out-of-home care residential settings, addressing perpetrators, being about intelligence gathering with the police, and also educative, therapeutic or protective initiatives around educating young people about risky behaviour or about healthy relationships. Generally, though, it's been raised that there is a lack of knowledge around this issue in Australian context, and there's a concern to ensure that there are fit-for-purpose responses, because how you understand an issue directs to the responses that we might make. So this research very briefly aimed to explore understandings of child sexual exploitation in terms of what this problem is and why it happens, and practice challenges and opportunities for responding to young people when there are concerns in relation to CSE or about risk to CSE. The objective was to provide an empirical research-based contribution to this emerging evidence base in Australia about defining and responding to CSE. This was a small qualitative research project involving 15 statutory caseworkers from across 3 of 4 offices in one district in one large Australian state. And caseworkers and teams had experience of child protection and out-of-home care service provision. They often case managed a young person for a year or more. Firstly, then, their understandings of what CSE is and why it happens. Child sexual exploitation was understood to be about survival sex and unmet needs. So this was understood in 2 ways. So survival sex was about young people who have an urgent material need for money or food or transport or a taxi fare or drugs or alcohol, and they are exploited to exchange sex or sexual activity for that something that they need. Or slightly differently, as we can see in the second quote here, that need could be an emotional need, feeling wanted, feeling loved, having security, or as a response to previous trauma or feelings of powerlessness, so about seeking control or wanting to regain or feel some kind of power and control. Additionally, this was understood to be about perpetrator gain. So these are people, abusers, who facilitate the sexual abuse of a child or young person for something that they receive. And we see this in the example here. So the caseworker says dad was selling off his oldest daughter for slabs of beer for sex. She was putting her hand up to do it to stop her 2 younger sisters, 9 and 7, from being sexually assaulted. So she said, I'll keep having sex with all these men, just don't get them to. It's important to note that in discussions with caseworkers about who exploits, I didn't directly ask about this, but in the examples that they gave when they shared different examples of instances where they'd come across this, perpetrators included family, which could include men and women, so mothers, fathers, and nans, people connected to family and community, so these were people that young people knew. Also, they talked about unknown, more organized perpetrators who target residential homes. So this is the kind of grooming gang style of perpetration, which some of you may be more familiar with. But also they talked about opportunistic abusers. So those who might not have set out to sexually abuse a young person, but they're either approached by a young person, for example, someone offering them sex for cigarettes or alcohol outside the supermarket. And then that person exploits that to abuse that child or young person. Or someone sees a child as vulnerable and offers to help but gives conditions. So it could be, for example, a taxi driver. I'll give you a lift and you don't have to pay the fare, but you do have to engage in some sort of sexual activity. In terms of why sexual exploitation happens, family were understood to be a significant factor. This could be in terms of being involved in the sexual exploitation of their children, as seen in the previous example, or it could be those who are involved indirectly because of behaviours or abuse that then underpin vulnerability to exploitation. So we can see this being discussed in the example here. So caseworker, we got this young person into care with the most beautiful lady out in a particular place, which I thought was going to be the best thing since sliced cheese. It was a lovely home, lovely lady. We got her doing her own washing, was helping her do the cooking, but maternal grandma was just up the road, and guess who gravitated straight back to Nan and Mum. Then I took the case up, so when I first got it, I couldn't get in contact with the young person. I had no idea where she was. So then we got her set up. She's in a caravan park here at the minute, still gravitating to Mum. And the last time she was going to Mum's at the weekend. So Mum the weekend that she goes to Nan happens to coincide with the weekend she gets paid. And it just really works out like that. And she bought like $100 worth of food and everyone ate her food. And then she had no money when she got back here. So they're talking about a young person whose Nan and Mum were taking their allowance, which then left them vulnerable to being exploited because they didn't have any money. And then sexual exploitation through survival sex becomes a real risk. Also, they talked about family in terms of the pool they can present for children and young people if care arrangements don't enable them to see their families or have contact. They could be in a position of running away, finding their own means to be able to see their family, seeking transport, and that can then be exploited by others. Secondly, lack of stable relationships and community networks. So caseworkers talked about the importance these outside of care or professional relationships, particularly for older teenage young people who are transitioning into adulthood. Caseworkers explain that young people who don't have friends or safe relationships can end up feeling isolated and lonely with unmet emotional needs, but they may also not have networks to draw on for help, which could leave them situationally or materially vulnerable to exploitation. And so we can see something of this in the frustrations of this caseworker in the second quote here. That's what constantly worries me about this young person, is that the safe people in her life are us, and we're paid to be in her life, and we're not at the weekend. Like, what does she do at the weekend or in the evening time? She has no one. Like, I can't go hang out with her at the weekend, or like, oh, I'm having dinner at my house, call over. Like, I just can't do that with her. Thirdly, they talked about living circumstances and placement stability or instability, and this is a factor for different interconnected reasons. So they talked about where these placements are. So we can see this in the example here, a placement that was wholly unsuitable because of its location and the triggering of trauma, meaning that young person was trying to get away from the home. So it's doubly problematic for them in terms of the emotional trauma and vulnerability just by being there where it was, but also the situational vulnerability in terms of the unsafe attempts that the young person would make to leave. Likewise, young people might be placed close to abusive families or problematic people, known people who might exploit them. Caseworkers also talked about the importance of young people having a sense of home. So some placements not being that place of security or bringing a sense of belonging for young people, which was understood to be particularly so for young people who'd been in a number of placements with breakdowns, in which for the young person, this could be experienced as rejection, impacting on their identity and sense of self as being an unwanted person, which then leaves them vulnerable to being exploited. And finally, connected to that was a particular concern for those in residential out-of-home care. So these caseworkers were reflecting on the absence of an intensive therapeutic home in their region. So young people may be in homes managed with less skilled or qualified staff who can understand trauma behaviours or just challenging behaviours and responses to need and provide a more therapeutic response, rather than unintentionally exacerbating young people's unmet needs by focusing on them as the problem and perhaps reinforcing feelings for the young person of not being listened to or feeling powerless or unwanted. Also, a group home situation can make it challenging to model and develop one-to-one relationships or have capacity to help young people to build these relationships outside of the home situation environment. So with that in mind, these caseworkers' understanding of what CSE is and why it happens, so what the problem is that they think they're trying to respond to and being part of a response, these are now some of the challenges and opportunities with trying to respond as the caseworkers see it. So firstly, they relayed challenges with identifying CSE. So this was either because they felt that there was a general lack of awareness or an informed understanding of the issue among carers, care providers, and other professionals across the multi-agency context. So these caseworkers felt that the focus for discussion tended to be about a young person's problematic, harmful, or sexualized behavior, and that might be attributed to being the outworking of trauma connected to a learning difficulty, or about young people's general poor behaviors, in which young people are more likely to be seen as putting themselves at risk and causing the issue, rather than being framed as a concern about exploitation or what's going on for the young person in terms of their unmet needs and vulnerability. So we can see an example of this in those two quotes. In the second one, if that child or adolescent, is sexually exploited, it's treated by others as blame coming onto them. And they're perceived as naughty. This is their fault. They just stayed at home and they didn't go out. And they know what it's like going down there. They shouldn't go near that pub or to that beach. So CSE is missed or misunderstood. Or, as seen in this final quote, young people are very unlikely to share about this abuse and they are unlikely to disclose. And this could be because of feelings of shame or worries about stigma, not being believed, a lack of trust in professionals and in the police, or a concern about what people might do in response and how that might be worse than what was currently happening to them. For these reasons, then, the challenge is a lack of shared understanding of CSE and a language about the issue that's in line with these caseworkers' understanding of the issue. Another challenge is the limited service provision, which these caseworkers felt tended to be crisis-oriented or about therapy. So this can present challenges in terms of prevention and what caseworkers can do in terms of responding to those needs that they see as significant to the issue, but also because therapy might not be what the young people want at that time. And again, it may not address the problem or all aspects of the problem. Relatedly then, as also seen in the quote here, if young people refuse that limited offer, then it becomes about them not engaging, rather than it being about a problem with the support being offered. So this is the caseworker saying, we're not thinking innovatively on how to support these kids therapeutically. It's, oh, well, they don't want it. They're not talking, they don't want it. What else can we do? Hands up in the air, We should be tailoring our care and our support for these kids in a way that's going to benefit them, not how we think they should take that service. So we go, oh, we've given you a therapist and you said no. That's an adult approach. We should be going and getting creative on how we can work with these children to get better outcomes. So caseworkers felt that decision makers need to understand the need for alternative assessments that might identify other forms of support that could address underpinning needs that cause vulnerability. So relatedly, caseworkers felt that clear opportunities lie with outreach and intensive support that's tailored to a young person's needs, rather than sexual exploitation prevention and intervention being about a specific programme or a model. So this would be about working with a young person to address needs in terms of connections and friendships, trusted figures, which would build confidence and self-esteem, and also provide support to help young people progress to living independently. And this would then tackle a range of different vulnerabilities that the young person might be experiencing. They also felt that more needed to be done to maintain placements and ensure stability. So looking at things like placement matching and supporting carers where there are good relationships, and understanding young people's views and needs when looking at care arrangements, particularly about identifying where there may be particular problem areas, for example, or close people around them. So you're responding to the trauma before it starts. They also felt that the department could have a role in supporting specific care replacements for young people who've been sexually exploited, particularly if a group home environment can't be found or isn't suitable. Coming back to the point about shared understanding of sexual exploitation in the multi-agency context, caseworkers felt that more could be done to ensure that there is a better understanding of young people who interact across different contexts in terms of involvement with the police, in health, and in education. So they talked about the need for a shared language and a shared understanding of CSE that aligns with their particular thinking about this issue that I've shared here in the research. And that should underpin and inform multi-agency dialogue about sexual exploitation, and also dialogue about young people's behaviours and inform decisions for necessary responses. So we see in the quote here, the police don't react because the kids are well known. A frequent absconder gets notified by police as a frequent absconder, not as a vulnerable young person that might be getting sexually exploited out in the field. They're classified as a frequent absconder. Let's reword that. Let's look at it in a different context, and let's say this child is vulnerable. And finally, as shown in the quotes here, caseworkers felt that given current arrangements and challenges, that there's a need for informed training and guidance for caseworkers on CSE and for carers too, and for access to specialist support to think through complex cases and advise on responses and intervention attempts for young people. So we can see here in the caseworker training, I think, the caseworkers now get bombarded with so much stuff. But if there was something specific when, they do that section of the module where they go and they could just see, I think that would be important, because some people that are caseworkers, they would never have those conversations in their lives. So they might feel awkward and uncomfortable that they're going to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, So I think that would be the stuff to make sure that we have a good grasp on. So guidance around not only what this issue is, but how they might approach those conversations with young people where they feel that there are concerns around sexual exploitation. And the second quote, it would be really good if there was someone who specialised in that field, because I think there's a little bit of lack of expertise when the carers are coming to the caseworkers and with these pretty difficult conversations. So in brief summary then, some key messages and implications. So in terms of understanding CSE, based on the views of these caseworkers, this opens up a more complex understanding of CSE than that which focuses on grooming and organised forms of sexual exploitation. Findings evidence a more complex picture of CSE, which centres unmet need in non-commercial forms of CSE alongside perpetrator gain. So this might be uncomfortable in recognising young people who may approach others offering sexual activity for something they need or they want or they crave. But the views of these caseworkers offers a way of understanding that in terms of exploitation of that young person, so due to their material, emotional or situational unmet need. So this is a way of understanding what's going on outside of focusing on behaviours and young people's sexualised or problematic behaviours. So in terms of key areas of vulnerability, family, friendships and community networks, living circumstances and statutory care involvement are domains for key risks that coalesce to inform vulnerability to CSE. So these are areas that can combine, but also they're significant areas for attention in their own right. So that more complex understanding of CSE is what informed these caseworkers' consideration of the challenges and also opportunities for how people could respond. So they feel that there isn't an informed understanding of CSE, which means that there's a lack of shared language about this abuse and about young people, and that affects how young people are viewed. So they're more likely to be picked up for their problematic sexual behaviour rather than being responded to as a vulnerable young person being abused, perhaps regularly, or certainly at very high risk of this happening. Caseworkers felt that responses for young people should be directed to understanding and addressing their care and support needs, and they felt that there could be opportunities for this within existing provision, consideration of care arrangements, and also in understanding the importance of mentoring and outreach support for young people, particularly those where there is perhaps a challenge to try and engage with young people where there's been kind of repeated casework and repeated placement moves. Overall, they felt that responses should also give consideration to placements and living circumstances, and these signal the importance of child-centred, well-being-oriented directions that are underpinned by a shared language in the multi-agency context and enhanced provision within existing systems. So these are some possible implications for practice directions and responses to sexual exploitation. So practice guidance and directions should recognise multiple models of sexual exploitation and its connection to a wider context of vulnerability and unmet needs than just individuals. There's a need for broader prevention strategies beyond those focused on perpetrator disruption and educative initiatives based around healthy relationships or risky problematic behaviour. CSE responses should be guided by child-centred practice and giving attention to unmet needs and their well-being. Outreach and support that addresses young people's emotional, social and practical needs are valuable directions. Suitable placements and ensuring young people have a safe and stable home environment is vital to any response to CSE. And training, guidance, access to specialist support and a shared language of CSE underpinned by the emerging CSE evidence base in Australia would all be valuable directions for developing policy and practice. Just before I finish, I want to repeat that this was a small-scale project and more research is needed, particularly in terms of hearing from young people with experiences of this abuse, but also giving attention to Aboriginal consideration and critique, given the numbers of Aboriginal children involved with out-of-home care and child protection services, but also in terms of the history and context for Aboriginal families and communities and their experiences with institutions. However, these findings do offer rich insights from those who are speaking with experience of supporting young people who have experience of this form of sexual abuse. So that's something to build on, and the findings also chime with other international research too. So if you do want to read any more about this, you can access these two papers that have been published. So they're from the research and they're free for you to access. So you can download them and read more if you want to. But thank you very much for listening.
Sorry, I apologize. Here I am talking to myself. Look, thank you, Sophie. That's an excellent presentation, and you're certainly right. It does raise, like, a lot of complexities, and it, I suppose, challenges people how they might ordinarily imagine some of this and how it manifests quite differently in reality. And I trust for practitioners, it requires a very nuanced sort of response. Thank you. So let's come to the Q&A session with our panel. So could I just remind people, please put the questions in the chat and we'll come back to those at the end. I'll start with Greg Hall, if that's okay. And one of the questions I'd like to put to Greg is, like, what are the implications of this research for our safety and care work, particularly with young people in residential care?
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Sophie. Look, I think immense. I think our tendency in all of our practices to focus on the word safety, sometimes for clear reasons. But I also think what Sophie's work bears out, and similar my experience in the UK bears out, is that a focus on safety often diminishes our ability to understand what is going on for young people, and ways in which we can spin that on its head and focus on well-being and focus on what is driving unmet need for young people is essentially a wonderful way to address both that and the safety issues. I think in terms of our own department, we do have the guidance that's been developed is probably been strongly influenced by Bernardo's early guidance in the UK. I think there's elements of that are useful, and certainly issues around grooming are really important for practitioners to understand. But there's also taking that approach without any subtlety, as you say, Matt, is really difficult, because there's so many young people that we will miss or we will not consider as perhaps the right kind of victim. Yeah, so I think that's a really important thing for us as a department to look at. Yeah, I think turning away from risk, or thinking about how we understand and formulate risk and all of the things that we do is just really important. We're a department that very much is oriented to risk, but I think risk focus on young people, as Sophie said, it can lead to us thinking about them as risky.
Sure, no, that makes total sense. And like, do you think Australia might experience a similar explosion in this focus on CSE, like we saw happen in the UK?
Look, I think there were specific elements in the UK which are different to Australia in terms of media focus on social work, in terms of some of the issues around a particular focus on race, on ethnicity there, which probably hasn't been as significantly looked at. And I think we're fortunate that we don't have the media, some of the issues around media that tend to make tend to drive a kind of focus on areas that aren't as important. I think that the media focus in the UK is very difficult for practitioners. There's a lot of pressure on practitioners there, which I wouldn't like to see, because I think most practitioners want to do good work. And really, when I supervise or do group supervisions with practitioners around child exploitation, what they're looking for is the ability to get more resources, to access support that perhaps the organisation hasn't really established well, and do things creatively, as Sophie said. I think one of the good things about the focus in the UK, or the explosion in focus, was turning practitioners towards the network. And we don't do enough of that. We don't recognise how young people exist in a network. And having practitioners who see their role as maybe being able to get out more, maybe understand peer relationships, understand what a young person is striving towards in terms of finding independence, that's really helpful for us getting a good sense of risk.
Okay, that's really good, Greg. Maybe just bringing Paul in. So Paul, could I ask, like, what, in your opinion, are the most frequent barriers that your team encounters when working with children who are at risk of being, or who are being sexually exploited, or at risk of being sexually exploited?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And thank you, Sophie, for your presentation. I would say it was a really great question. I would say that quite one thing that sits quite definitely in that space really is there are very few specialist services that my teams can refer to seek the sort of intensive outreach and assertive outreach support that children and young people often need to help them divert away from sexual exploitation. I think the other thing that we find in the cases that get referred to my team is that focus on the network mapping. So not so much the multi-agency groups, but the family and friends and safe adult groups that often sit around some of these children that have gone unnoticed whilst we've been, as Greg so eloquently put, focusing on just the risk rather than the situation. I would also say that children, in our experience, often feel very blamed for their experiences and judged, and that sometimes also comes out in some of the case recordings that we see. So I would say, certainly from a child perspective, that's what I'm looking at. I think what Sophie mentioned also was that the cross-agency understanding of child sexual exploitation, because it's so risk-focused, other agencies tend to pass that risk to DCJ or other lead agencies solely to manage, with very little support from police and health and education.
No, thank you. So, Paul, if we were to think more like on a systems level, what do you think would be most effective enabling government and NGOs to work collaboratively to detect this CSE and improve outcomes for children who may be being sexually exploited?
Well, I think as Greg and Sophie have touched on, is that we desperately need a common language and a common framework for all people, all professionals who work with children to understand the specifics of child sexual exploitation. I think England and Wales developed a child exploitation disruption toolkit, which is a wonderful toolkit that's can be picked up by any agency or any professional who works with a young person or child who's being sexually exploited, to enable them to, one, sort of understand what the issues could be for that young person, find the right pathways for seeking support across the multi-agency system, and also, develop some ways in which they can support and effectively intervene with that young person to enable them to feel more supported and understood.
Yeah, no, thank you. So just maybe turning to Dana, as a practitioner, like what do we do to better align our understanding and response to the possible function of a child or young person's behaviours?
Thanks, Matt, and I would echo everybody's comments. Thank you, Sophie, for your comments and for the research that you've undertaken. I think, one of the things that, if we do listen intentionally to Sophie's research findings, I think it is incumbent on us to make sure that we are undertaking that child-centred and well-being oriented approach, not only to CSE, but also the broader context of vulnerability in which it exists. And I think, echoing on from everybody's comments, when we are able to align our understanding and response to the function of a young person's behaviour, we would generally commence with a commitment to locating that young person's behaviour in the broader ecology of their whole life, their family, their social context, their environment, and those developmental factors, because behaviours actually serve really vital adaptive functions for young people, and they importantly give us clues regarding a young person's unmet needs, but most importantly, how we can be responsive to those needs and thereby address any behavioural concerns more effectively. And I think one of the most important roles we can play in supporting young people is to assume that position of curiosity. And that means doing what everybody has spoken about. That means looking beyond what's in front of us to explore the underlying need in disguise of behaviour. And that requires us to work in partnership with the young person and also those invested in their care to develop a detailed and a shared understanding through what we would refer to as formulation-driven practice. And what we do is we observe reactions, we identify triggers, we note patterns and trends, and we seek to understand how mechanisms and historical factors and contextual or even systemic influences may intersect, and how those things together shape a young person's presentation at any given time. I think that the other thing about this work is that sometimes we work on the basis of our best guess. And it's really important that when we are developing hypotheses, that we do attribute need, particularly hypotheses that we're attributing to need apologies. We need to continually test and refine those as new information emerges, because if our interventions are not responding to the underlying function of a behaviour, it's highly likely that the behaviour will continue. And I think Sophie's work really offers a call to action in relation to the way we think about young people, and also the broader interface between CSE and vulnerabilities that are inherent in our systems of care. And understanding that wider context of CSE is critical to formulation-driven practice. And as we've spoken about, when CSE is viewed solely through a grooming lens or mistakenly aligned with problematic, harmful sexual behaviour, our formulation or our belief set that guides our practice is impeded by the absence of an informed understanding and by misattunement. An unchecked bias or working to risk-based formulas unfortunately positions the young person away from our consideration. And when that happens, I think we become really susceptible to re-entering a bit of a cycle of mutual distress, where we are just another set of adults who don't get it for a young person. And when we ignore the contexts in which CSE is possible for young people, we sort of leave those young people feeling more alone, or indeed the target of concern, that blaming, I think, that Paul referred to. And as a result, we have young people continuing to experience unmet need that impacts on their healing and their recovery. And we have carers and support staff who experience great levels of frustration, sometimes resentment, sometimes anger, and a lot of the time feelings of powerlessness and helplessness. So I think that concept around really learning from Sophie's work and ensuring that the work that we do in this space is underpinned by robust and rigorous policy is a really good start. And when that is in place, it kind of offers that opportunity to work collaboratively with young people and giving them and seeing them as agents, both in setting the terms of their own support, but also tailoring our intervention to their own and specific, unique experiences, their needs and their circumstances. Because really what we want to do is create environments that reduce triggers and increase feelings of connection and safety wherever we can.
So Dana, can I ask you a really practical question? Like, how might a caseworker go about a discussion with a young person dealing with this?
It's a big question, so thank you. But I guess it's in the first instance, it's really common for young people to resist conversations about sexual exploitation, particularly if they feel embarrassed, if they feel ashamed, or they feel judged. And so the first thing that I think that we might do in approaching a conversation is really consider what barriers might be relevant for your young person to assist your approach. Is it that they might be frightened to discuss the topic? Is it that they're unable to recognise the exploitative nature of the exchange or the relationship that they are engaged in? Or is it as though they feel as though they've provided consent? So I guess the first thing would be to consider a young person's experience and what it might be like for them in undertaking this conversation with you. I think the other significant thing that I would recommend is really embark on conversations after a really careful process of planning and self-reflection. Reflection is a really important precursor to being present and stilling ourselves so that we can be open to opportunities and also that we can approach sensitive topics in non-threatening and non-judgmental ways. A lot of this sort of really refers to you as a caseworker going in. And so part of that for you is the importance of staying calm and neutral. When we're calm and we're neutral, we are much more able to stay engaged. We are much more purposeful in our responses. And that's the case even when we might not agree or we might not feel comfortable with the behaviours that a young person is presenting with. So that neutral presence can also help decrease experiences of shame and worry and secrecy. And the other part of that is also considering what might take you away from that position of neutrality. So consider how you might stay centered. Consider how you might manage your emotions should the young person become dysregulated or shut down.
Sure. Sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to.
No, not at all. I was just having a little, another little thought bubble there. I guess the other thing that's really critical to this is that trusting conversations build protective factors and reduce harm. So as much as you can, involve young people from the beginning so that they have some experience of being in control of how the topics are discussed, in what environment those discussions occur, maybe when they occur, with whom they occur, for how long they occur, and think around those broader issues of risk and safety, some of those things that we've already spoken about today. It may be important that you are discussing limits to confidentiality or ways that you can come to an agreement together about the sharing of information with others and how that might happen. And as we've also spoken about, really considering the needs of the young person, what their needs might be. There are going to be some really important cultural considerations that will exist when you are supporting young people from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background, or a young person from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, or another person who identifies as non-binary. So think about what considerations and actions might be relevant to your session planning. And I guess the last thing is really consider how to do well. A lot of this, you don't need to be great at it, and kids are really often incredibly forgiving of us, but often it comes through intentionally remaining responsive to little openings, so that if you listen carefully enough, there might be a suggestion for where you might go next. And think about how you might be able to potentially open up space for kids or young people to discuss the tip of the iceberg aspects of their experience that they're willing to disclose, really understanding the role of shame in the context of this work. And it's also about considering how you might leave the door open to say more later, or even thicken the conversation over time, or consider using a vignette approach. So consider talking about a hypothetical friend rather than first-person language, just to allow you to have a realistic outline of a situation that might facilitate your discussions. And beyond that, I think the most other really important thing is it's really important to consider how we approach this. It's also really important to consider how you might ensure a safe closure to that conversation as it exists for young people as well.
No, thank you very much, Dana. So maybe Paul, what interventions or casework approaches have you come across that works well in, children who might be experiencing CSE and diverting them from perpetrator networks?
What I found, I think, it's often referred to in research as sustained safeguarding. And that really is, understanding what those unmet needs are. So, yes, we're looking at risk, but then, we need to then understand what those unmet needs are, and then seek to support the child or young person through intensive relational-based support that enables the child to get some sort of relational security with key professionals. Safe members of the family, other trusted adults and peers. And what we're seeking to do there is to create a counterbalance to what often is called or termed as the pull of a child towards sexual exploitation. And that was a very easy sentence to say and a very difficult piece of work to do. But when I've seen that sort of proactive approach undertaken, that can include, the daily contact, calls, text messages, unannounced visits, trying to think creatively within the child's space of how to maintain that contact, and then how to deal with the level of rejection that practitioners often feel when the young person is rejecting all of that and still going on with the behaviours. And what I say to people who talk to me quite often about the cases that they're managing is that persistence is the key, and that persistence being measured and tempered by the child's own tolerance levels to rather than putting an adult risk or safeguarding sort of matrix across it. It really is knowing your child, understanding your child, and understanding what the rejection is about. Because over time, I've seen children successfully diverted away from sexual exploitation through engaging all of those elements, not forgetting peers, trusted adults, or adults that they trust, and to some degree us having the courage to trust some of their safe judgments about certain people rather than tarring all of the people that this young person knows with the same brush, or looking at Child's Story and thinking, well, back in 1996 this happened and therefore we can't trust them. I think we really just need to keep ourselves very open to how that works. I've also encountered missing from care interviews. So when a child leaves a residential unit, for example, having a formal or semi-formal type interview process that really is inquisitive about where have you been, who have you seen, did you feel safe or unsafe, that sort of thing. And I can't sort of say this, underpin this enough. I mean, there is a need for specialist sexual exploitation services. We don't have any, as far as I know. And where we do have them, they're very small and very localized. And I think that that coupled with specific drug and alcohol services for children and young people, where girls who have been sexually exploited, for example, can seek and have drug and alcohol support separate to boys and men, is crucially important, and an element that we haven't really discussed today, but one that I think certainly in my experience, drug and alcohol is a key lure for children and young people at this point.
No, thanks, Paul. I'm just mindful of time, and there's some good questions in the chat. Jamie asks, are there any reflections from this research or others regarding online exploitation? As in out-of-home care, we find lots of young people exchanging images for unmet needs, but this might be seen as normal across their peer group. Sophie, is that something you might like to speak to?
The difference between kind of online and kind of in-person sexual exploitation wasn't something that practitioners talked about, but I think it's definitely something that young people and research with young people has explored. I think the starting point is that it's not something, that differentiation between what happens in the online world and what happens with the offline world is just not something that's often made by young people. It tends to be what us kind of older adults who kind of came to technology through age, what we tend to think. I think the kinds of issues that this research is exploring still apply, whether it's kind of the sharing of online images. I think it's that point about making sure that you don't assume why a young person's doing that. And it's a similar sort of thing that we wouldn't want to think, or a young person thinks this behavior is normal. Quite often young people are saying, I know that this may be problematic, but this is why I'm engaged in this, or this is why I'm doing it. So it would be the same kinds of messages, really, that your starting point would be thinking what's going on for this young person and trying to make sense of it from their perspective, and giving space for them to have that conversation. Like Paul kind of raised the issue around young people feeling that they're going to be stigmatized and feeling deep shame. You have to be able to have a conversation where a young person can talk about what they're doing without feeling that immediately there's going to be judgment about, you know, the starting point is that what you're doing is problematic. They won't then talk to you about it or really open up about why they might be sharing that. You've got to give the space and give open space for a conversation with them to talk to them about what's happening and why are they engaged in this. So it would be similar kinds of messages, even though something might be happening online and something might be happening offline.
No, thank you. That's a really good point. I'm just mindful of time. We've got a few minutes left. So I'd like to ask all of our panel members, including Sophie, one final question, which is, what's the one takeaway message you'd like to leave our audience thinking about at the completion of today? Maybe Greg, do you want to go first?
Yeah, look, because I know how difficult this is to find solutions for in practice, I think it's really important to people to kind of turn the spotlight back on us and look at what are the ways in which our systems potentially remove control from young people and potentially lead them to behave in ways which are in some senses are seeking out of control, but not necessarily in a good way. And I think we certainly in my district, we're looking a lot at out-of-home care, at visiting to kids in out-of-home care, and how much we actually listen to young people, talk to them about what makes them happy. Basic stuff around the child and young person's view of how they're going in their placement, and forefronting that in terms of what can we do to address unmet needs that are appearing there.
No, thanks, Greg. Dana?
I think an extension on Greg's comments, really. For me, I think it's that take-home message around how we can really deepen our practice and be willing to go further in our attempts to understand but also involve young people in whether it's formulation-driven practice or whether it's decision-making, because our young people are the most vulnerable and they deserve responses that are evidence-based. They deserve responses that are integrated and trauma-informed and culturally safe, and most importantly, that are sensitive to their perspectives, to their needs, to their vulnerabilities, to their strengths and their capacities as well.
Thank you. Paul?
Yes, Matt, following on from Greg and Dana, I would add, and I frequently remind my team of this, is that, you know, that we are already equipped in many ways to be able to do the work. This is a big subject, but child-led, person-centered, empathetic practice that finds an approach that fits with the child that you're working with, rather than fitting the child around a particular approach, is what I feel I've taken from Sophie's research and from this session. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Sophie, do you have any closing comments?
Just that I can see people looking at wanting more guidance, and I would just encourage you to be mindful that what's out there is quite old. Do look at reading what's out there in terms of accessible research. We do need to think about sexual exploitation in a more complex way, thinking about vulnerability in the context of unmet need and well-being, and directing our responses to understanding and hearing from young people. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. And look, and thanks to everybody who's joined today and all of the speakers. So as we touched on before, if you registered, you'll get the link. So a copy of this webinar today, and it's going to be uploaded onto the Lunch and Learn website. Just finally, we have an ad or a plug for our next Lunch and Learn, and that is going to be on the 27th of May at 12 p.m. So this webinar will be supporting children living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and their carers. And registration details were put up in the chat, and we hope to see you there. So thank you very much, everyone.